All right. Hello, Paul. Hello, everyone.
Hey,
We This is episode 18 of Dispersing the Fog. We're moving along very nicely here. This is July 6th, 2025. I want to welcome everybody to the show this week. We have a really great show lined up for you this week. We have a special guest that's going to be joining us in the second half. Uh, Paul, it's where the old line, the call is coming from inside the house, or well, I guess somebody who recently left the house. The call is coming from a high-ranking former RCMP officer, and we're going to be hearing from just such a person later on in the episode. Former RCMP officer Curt Allen is going to be joining us. Very high-ranking, Paul. Amazing that he's going to be a guest on the show.
well, yeah, Curt Allen was four times, as I understand it, four times deputy commissioner, sort of oversaw all aspects of the RCMP during his career there. Left, went into policing, continued on in policing and security, working for banks and other government agencies, and was just recently retired from the Halton Regional Police Board. So he's been active in policing for, 5 or 6 decades.
Yeah, so
And he's going to be very interesting for you to meet.
I can't wait. I We just had a few emails this week, but and checked out his online profile, such as it is. But really looking forward to seeing what he has to say, and I'm sure we'll get back into a little bit of the the Nova Scotia Policing Review, the mass casualty, and the situation currently with the RCMP across the country. All with Curt Allen a little later on in the show. So looking forward to that, and I think lots of people are going to be excited to hear what he has to say. Paul, you've had a good week. I think we've had a good week. I'm going to take a little credit for this too, but you've Anatomy of a Cover-Up is still doing gangbusters. I see this week that it is the number two ranked Canadian nonfiction book on the Toronto Star's list of bestsellers and also the Globe and Mail list. So awesome there. And I have a question about this one. It's number one ranked in the Toronto Star's original nonfiction list. So my question, before I move on, my question about that is, what is original nonfiction as compared to unoriginal nonfiction, or what's the
I
breakdown?
have
Any
no
idea?
idea. I think that, like nonfiction includes stories about maps and, self-help books and whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a broad category. All I know is what I'm doing is what newspapers and the media isn't doing. So maybe that's a way to qualify it.
Well,
I had a good conversation today with this week with a journalist during a podcast that's going to be broadcast next week. And during that conversation, the person said, um, "You know, we don't have the time and the resources to do the kind of investigation you did." So this is the mass media that supposedly has money and manpower, women power, and whatever. They don't have the money to do what you and I and Chad Jones and others have done over the last 5 years with the mass casualty and what happened in Nova Scotia and brought this story forward. Meanwhile, we do it. I write a book that incorporates all our work, and then the media says, well, we can't really pay attention to it because we don't really trust what you did. We'd have to verify it all. And we don't have the manpower or personnel to pursue this story. So it's like a closed loop. They never have the manpower and they don't trust anyone else. So the stories don't get done.
isn't that amazing? That's yeah, a little bit of irony there. Yeah, we love what you're doing. We can't report on it
Yeah, we
because
can't report on it because we can't verify it. We don't trust you to verify it. This gets back to, this is a digression from earlier, but if you've ever read, like, there's a 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. And that book was pilloried at the beginning, but it is a classic. The government, nobody wanted this book to come out. And what it describes is how the media is essentially built on what Herman called the propaganda model of news. And what the propaganda model is, the media only relies on official sources for everything. So the people in power, in policing, and government and business put out press releases essentially and dictate what the news is going to be. And then the media becomes stenographers, write it down and report it. And anything outside of that is not considered news. It's subversive.
Yeah.
And so, if we look at what we're in now, this is the absolute propaganda model of reporting. Only official stories count, and things that we do doesn't count because it's not coming from an official source. Okay.
Yeah, it really limits what people it limits what people hear and understand because the media is so pervasive and that's where people go. That's the trusted source in many ways, and it's hard for people to read a book and take the time to do so in some cases. But if the media could report on your book, Paul, and just say, here's what the book says. They don't have to say, and we verify all this. We just say, all right, here's what this new best-selling book seems to claim, and maybe you want to go read it and think for yourself. But they don't even
But
do
they
that.
can't do that because what I've done in the book is virtually every major media source, I point out what they did wrong. So they don't want people reading the book because I'm pointing out what they did wrong. And they're a bit thin-skinned about that. So what we have now is this unique situation in Canada that I've seen, that I have a book that's been, since it came out on June 10th, has been at the top of the bestseller list in Canada, right across Canada.
Yeah.
And we have the entire mass media, legacy media and alternative media on this side, and the government and the police all on this side ignoring it, especially in Nova Scotia, where it was
Mhm.
set, totally ignoring it. And on
I haven't
this
seen
side, we
anything. Yeah.
have readers building up and understanding the story and showing, beginning to understand what happened and telling their friends about it. So we have this standoff going on, and you wonder how long it's going to be before this breaks down because it can't last forever. All this side is doing is hoping we melt and go away, and we're not going to melt and go away.
It's unusual in this sense too, Paul. Like I know, the media entities, the reporters, columnists for different media organizations. One of the things they're incentivized to do, as I can seem to grasp, is to gain, increase their own profiles. Well, if this was the US or the UK, trying to increase your own profile, one of the best way to do that would be to get into a beef with somebody, get into a back and forth with a prominent author, say this guy, this guy wrote a book, it's a bestseller, but he doesn't know what he's talking about for these reasons, and then you put out your side, and then maybe you'd react to it with a column, and it would go back and forth, and everybody's profile would be raised. But nobody's even taken the bait in that sense.
Well, one of the reasons is how the media used to operate. But under the propaganda model, you brought that up. Thank you for bringing that up. Under the propaganda model, one of the things that media do is avoid flack, avoid controversy at all cost. It's like you're selling a product. You want everything nice said about it and no controversy whatsoever, no flack. So they're not going to engage me. And I'm telling a story here. Going back to last week, who killed Corey Ellison? Nobody wants to talk about that, but that story is going to grow because people see it. It's a human story. And if this was going on in the United States, that a mass casualty had happened, and then the government and the police covered up one of the people and maybe more, but one for sure was accidentally shot by the police, and the police covered that up. Media would be fighting to tell that story.
Yeah.
In Canada, they run the other way because, oh no, well, we're too busy. We have flower shows to cover. We have Parliament to cover. We have this. This is a big story. It's about the rule of law. It's about one individual who was accidentally killed, and the police did everything to keep it quiet. Who killed Corey Ellison? We're going to find out.
Yeah, and that little who killed Court, that's gonna catch on. By the way, you know what else is gonna catch on is Chad Jones. I thought he did a great job with us last week. I know we got some really nice comments on the video and the podcast version of it. So Chad was enjoying his life of anonymity before, and that's over now.
And, Chad is a brilliant researcher, and um, if Chad Jones gives you a call, answer it. His heart's in the right place, and he's smart, and he knows what he's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So, Paul, the other thing that happened this week, sort of, I was waiting to see what kind of reaction there would be to this Nova Scotia Policing Review report. And, of course, we had our piece to say. Well, who else had a piece to say this week was Steve Murphy. And for people across the country who might not be as familiar with Steve Murphy as we are here in Nova Scotia and the Maritimes, host of the CTV Atlantic news, lead news program. He was there, he was there Peter Mansbridge, I guess I'd put it that way, or Lloyd Robertson, I guess if you want to stick with CTV. Lead host, lead interviewer, and so he's retired a couple of years now, but he does these pieces every once in a while. Murphy's Logic. And so this week he was talking about the policing review, and you just couldn't believe it, right? He said actions speak louder than words, and often the actions are slow in coming and disappointing. And he said this week, dramatic, between the shootings themselves and the mass casualty, they revealed all these shortcomings in staffing, slow response times for the RCMP. And he said those predated the Mass Casualty Commission reporting and the mass shooting, and that and I thought he was kind of maybe pointing to us in a way here. He said even critics of the Mass Casualty Commission were either surprised or impressed by the recommendations, the calls for reform of the RCMP, and the RCMP was identified throughout as the problem, and now they're being put forth as the solution by the Nova Scotia government. So he didn't see it. So a highly respected voice, I guess, in the East Coast media landscape is on side and on board with the same views as us. So that seems to mean something.
Well, I also noticed the Todd Vino show the other day had Becky Drouin, the current Public Safety Minister, Attorney General of Nova Scotia, defending it, saying this is the best way forward. I don't think this woman understands policing. Yeah, she's an elected politician and she's the public safety minister, but she sits in a ministry where the Department of Justice is packed with ex-RCMP giving her advice. Geez, what could go wrong there?
Yeah.
Who's whispering in her ear, and she doesn't have the sense, nor does Premier Houston have the sense to recognize they're being sold a bill of goods like they've always been sold. That's why we have the problems we have in policing where the RCMP are, because the RCMP infiltrates the Justice Department and recommends themselves. There's no such thing as an ex-Mountie, except in the case maybe of Curt Allen, who'll be coming on in a little while.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Like I haven't seen the premier make any direct comments. Maybe he hasn't. I just haven't seen it. But about the report, for the minister, the minister's going to support or defend it, I guess, for now until it becomes unpopular. But I would think with us, Steve Murphy, others reporting on this and criticizing the report and the response, that might be the start of a movement in the opposite direction. But who knows?
But let's get on to the fun thing I want to talk about.
So the other thing, yeah, so this was an interesting week in another way because big week for some people across the country. The Order of Canada. There was, I think, 80 some people, 83 or 86 people named to the Order of Canada this week. And That's a big deal, Paul. Neither of us got the phone call, although I might have missed a few calls. I don't know if you would. Actually, I'm going to ask about that after.
I didn't get a call, I have to admit, but I never expect a call. Um,
Well, that's the
we in our current role, we do not fit the criteria for Order of Canada. Like, you know,
well.
Order of Canada people?
I
You
do.
must.
Okay, so I know a few people who have been named to the Order of Canada. I want to mention. Okay, I'll do a little name dropping in a moment, but the Order of Canada. What is it for people that don't know? It's the cornerstone of the Canadian honor system. It's been in place since the centenary of 1967 for outstanding achievements, dedication to the community, and service to the nation. The Desiderantes Meliorum Patrium is the Latin phrase. They desire a better country. There have been 7,600 plus investees. You are invested into the Order of Canada. That's when you get named criticized in some ways as a Laurentian sort of Ontario, Quebec thing where many academics and, scientists, artists from Quebec and Ontario seem to get named ahead of people from the hinterlands of Canada. This year, some of the people named were BC Public Health head Bonnie Henry, Maureen McTeer, who is a lawyer, former wife of former Prime Minister Joe Clark, big leader in women's health and women's rights. Ted Nolan, people would know, former NHL coach who does a lot of work with Indigenous youth. Teresa Tam, people would know this name, one of the more prominent names on the list, head of Health Canada, guided Canada through the pandemic. Bruce Anderson, I don't know if people are involved in politics, they'd know Bruce Anderson, prominent political commentator, used to be one of the members of the At Issue panel. Now he does podcasts with Peter Mansbridge. There's that name again, who I think is also in the Order of Canada. I'm sure he is. The other one named, probably the most famous name this year, is Georges St-Pierre. You know him, Paul, big fan, I'm sure. MMA world champion, many times over, welterweight and middleweight champion. I was traveling to Panama. This is, geez, close to 15 years ago when he was fighting. There was a poster of Georges St. Pierre. It was the height of a 15-story building. Like it was huge. I never saw anyway. Huge world champion. So some Nova Scotians named this year as well, some scientists and artists that people may know, but uh,
Yeah, but
there's a few, I know a few. I know Chief Stephen Augustine, the Mi'kmaq hereditary chief, who I've gotten to know quite well. Albert Marshall, a Mi'kmaq elder, I've gotten to know as well through works with the courts and such. But yeah, there was another. Well, actually, Paul, I should.
well, wait. Before we get to that other one,
Yeah.
I have, well, in journalism, Canadian journalism, there are some people who have received the Order of Canada, but they're not investigative reporters. They're people like Andre Picard. Uh,
Oh yeah,
you know,
I recognize that name. Like, but you must have dealt with, interviewed, encountered people in the Order of Canada. Like, do they do they have an aura, a glow to
no,
them?
they tend to be like, good. Most of them are good, hardworking people. He said scientists, doctors, the odd journalist here or there. You know, Michael DeAdder, the
That's right.
great cartoonist from Halifax, who worked for the Washington Post as well. He's as edgy as it probably gets
Yeah.
for an Order of Canada winner. I mean, I remember, I've literally rubbed shoulders with one Order of Canada member one time on a plane where, we were sitting there chatting, and I finally said, "So, what do you do?" And he said, "I'm an astronaut." Um, Mark Garneau.
Oh yeah.
That brought me down to earth, as they say. So that was an Order of Canada guy I'd met. And there was another one I met who shows you that not all people who get the Order of Canada are wonderful people. This fellow was, Order of Canada, prominent citizen, had a frequently commented on society and politics, and turned out he was an art collector, and he bought some things from Sharon when she was in Ontario, and didn't pay, owed $2,500. She After we moved to Nova Scotia, he still didn't pay. So one time we were visiting Guelph, Ontario, and we drove by where this guy's apartment was, and I stopped and knocked on the door, and there was no one there. And Sharon said, "Well, he's not home. What are you going to do?" I said, "I didn't want him to be home. I want to leave a message on his phone now." So I left a
Yeah.
message on his phone, said who I was. You owe $2,500. I came to collect it. Going back to Hamilton right now to my parents' place. Here's the number there. Um, I'll come back. I'm not sure when I'll come back, and if I have to go back to Nova Scotia and can't find you, my acquaintances from Hamilton will come and visit you sometime and come and collect the money. And I no sooner got to my parents' house about 30 minutes away, and the phone rang, and this guy was frantic. Oh, no, 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 no! I meant to pay. It's not like it was $2 million and worth stealing. I thought that's an odd
Okay,
comment. That's an odd comment for an Order of Canada guy.
that's a funny way to put it. So if it had been
Yeah,
two
yeah,
million, it
yeah.
would have been all right.
For
Well,
for a lawyer too.
different story.
And lo and behold, he eventually paid. Didn't pay the full amount. We just finally let it go. And sometime afterwards, he was caught with his fingers in the till, got disbarred, and lost the Order of Canada. So just because someone has the Order of Canada, yeah, check beneath the covers. Make sure that this is legitimate. It's not just some bagman for a political party, or a guy who bought us, or a man or woman who bought their way to the top by being, a smiley face on the outside, and basically that hand coming out underneath, going to fleece you.
Yeah, there's some philanthropists and business people on there. When you mentioned, yeah, so there's some people lose the Order of Canada or reject it in the first place. Mordecai Richler famously did twice. Some others did as well. Uh, Buffy St. Marie had hers taken back. I thought when you mentioned astronaut, I thought you were going to say Julie Payette,
Yeah.
the former Governor General, there was a request, I think, for her to be taken off the Order of Canada, but she's still there
And
for emergency.
great job she did as Governor General. Yes, let's applaud.
Yeah.
But let's move on. Let's move
So
on
there
to
was another
who
Nova.
got the Order of Canada this week.
So the other Nova Scotian, prominent Nova Scotian that was named to the Order of Canada was J. Michael MacDonald, the former Chief Justice of Nova Scotia, a who the Order of Canada induction brief says that he helped make the province a national leader in access to justice, promoted judicial outreach initiatives, and wrote 500 decisions. Former member of the Canadian Judicial Council and chair of the Mass Casualty Commission, now chair of Phoenix Youth Programs. Okay, so parse a little bit of that. If you're the Chief Justice of a province, you are on the Canadian Judicial Council. That's not some anyway. It's good to be the Chief Justice of a province, but that's not a separate, distinct appointment there. Judicial outreach, yes, he did do some work with, street crime outreach. He did some youth programming when he was Chief Justice. Did met with community groups. That made the news. He also then later was paid. I think I should note to do a report on street crime and how that it was treated by the Halifax police. Help make the province a national leader in access to justice. I'd have to I'd have to hear more about that one. That wasn't I don't think Nova Scotia's too far ahead of anybody else in access to justice initiatives. But it's one of the anyway though. So that's the introduction to J. Michael MacDonald, Chief Justice. Now, when you go through the list, Paul, of the people on the Order of Canada, especially the highest level, the companion, a lot of former justices of the Supreme Court of Canada are on that list. Not automatic that you would be the Chief Justice of a province and make the Order of Canada. So this was a notable, I guess, addition.
So what do you think deep down about this? 25 words or less.
Okay, so I'll be quick. one of the things when I think of all these things he's done, it's like the old madman quote. That's what the money's for. He was paid to do all those things, and I think it would be appropriate to wait a bit after the Mass Casualty Commission, his most prominent thing, to see how it turns out. Because so far, we've got this report on a commission that was highly criticized, and the report hasn't really caught on. So this is his crowning achievement. The other thing I'll say, the last thing I'll say, the 500 decisions. When as a lawyer, you're looking for decisions that are really well done and influential, you know the judges to look for. Ann Derrick, Thomas Cromwell, there's a few others. Wouldn't have said his name right away. So not surprised to see his name there. Maybe says more about the Order of Canada than J. Michael MacDonald.
Adam, no one deserved it more than J. Michael MacDonald to get the Order of Canada.
Okay.
He had an enormously difficult job to do. He had to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. The story was, the mass casualty, the subject of my book, Anatomy of a Cover Up. Well, he was the guy at the top of the Mass Casualty Commission managing the cover up. And he did a pretty effective job in telling that story, the story they wanted to tell. I mean, he had to rely on the least likely witnesses to prove the case he wanted to prove and ignore the eyewitnesses like at the Oslo Belmont Fire Hall or the videotape at the Enfield Big Stop where Wortman was stopped, or Gabriel Wortman's criminal behavior and all the indications that he was a police agent for the RCMP in New Brunswick. He had to ignore that, and that was not an easy thing to do. It was like, Mr. Wolf in Pulp Fiction. Remember Mr. Wolf, the great
Yes,
Harvey Keitel
yeah,
character?
great role.
After Vincent and Jules blow the guy's head off and they have to clean the car up, Mr. Wolf tells him to use a blanket in the back seat to cover the bloodstained seat so that a curious cop might not look twice at it. That was his job. Basically, put a blanket over this so no curious people will see what was really going on in this case. It's unbelievable. I think he did, and he had to keep like a stoic look on his face the whole time. Remember how we called them the stone-faced puppets? Because
Wow.
mainly you and me and everyone else who was paying attention could see the strings being pulled, but he had to pretend that he was stern and committed and doing this disinterested job that he was supposed to be doing. Meanwhile, he should have been laughing at some of the testimony and how preposterous it was, especially from RCMP members who were there, not testifying, doing a public interview, I think is the
Yeah.
phrase he used. So at the end of the day, he was a good soldier right to the end, and he deserved the Order of Canada for that. Oh, but he did leave out one thing.
What's that?
Who killed Corey Ellison, Mr. MacDonald?
He
He
did.
forgot to look at that.
Yeah. Well, absolutely, Paul. Anyway, yes, well put. He watching him every day do his introductions. I mean, I made the comment at the time that it had been a while since he had been a trial judge. He didn't seem to be light on his feet in terms of reacting to comments, but maybe that was the whole idea. You get somebody in there that'll just has the reputation, has the credentials, and they could lean on that to stop a lot of questions from being asked.
And he had experience because in the criminal case of former Premier Gerald Regan, who had multiple sexual assault charges, he made them all disappear magically. He heard the evidence he heard was not the evidence just about anyone else heard, and he made the case disappear. So he should have got the Order of Canada for that too. Maybe that's what it was for. Maybe
Yeah.
that's why he was brought in.
Well, so that was exciting news this week. Paul, I see, There have been a number of authors named, and it's all supposed to be in service of Canada. If this Order of Canada is a legitimate cornerstone of the Canadian honor system, talking about people who've done service to the nation, I think your books talking about the RCMP and the, you know, policing across the country, I think that fits the bill. I can't wait to see you invested into the
Ha!
order in years to come.
I don't think it's going to happen. So there.
Oh, well, we'll hold
You
our
have
breath.
a better chance.
Well, we'll see. I'll we'll get the listeners to take bets on who gets in first.
Well, you have a better chance, but not while you're hanging out with me.
No,
That,
that's my problem. That's going to be what happens.
that's your
Be
problem,
like,
right?
we were going to consider him, but I don't know about the people the company he keeps.
Yeah.
So that's the way.
Let's move on. We got a guest waiting.
Yeah, we have a guest waiting, and we're very excited. So we're going to bring in Curt Allen right now. Paul, are you ready?
Here
Yep,
we go.
ready. Let's bring him in. All right. Make sure this works properly. There he is. We see the,
His microphone is off.
yeah, microphone is off, and we'll,
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
yes.
can.
Can you? But you can't see me.
Can't
Yeah.
see you.
Well,
Yeah.
that's lucky. That's lucky for your people that are watching.
There you are.
How you doing?
Great.
Doing great. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well,
So,
thanks for the invitation. I mean, I want to thank you guys for the great work you're doing and have been doing for some time. I watch regularly, although I must say that my watching has fallen off a little bit of late. But you guys are doing great work, and I appreciate it. I'm a big proponent of public safety, and you're doing great work.
so Curt, I early on we introduced. I gave a bit of a background. You could probably fill in a little more. That I said you were a deputy commissioner, I think four different times or four different posts, and you moved into other policing. You worked in security at banks and other. And can you just give us a brief background and the fact that you're from Nova Scotia?
Yeah, well, I think I was born in Yarmouth Hospital probably, and now they didn't shut down after that. So I guess I couldn't have been that much of a shock to the system. But I was born and raised in Yarmouth. At the age of 20, after trying a bit of farming and fishing, I decided I wanted to try something else, and so I joined the RCMP. Like everybody else, I went off to boot camp, and then I actually lived in 5 provinces. I had a successful career in the RCMP from my perspective, and 36 years later, I left. I was a deputy commissioner, if that's part of your question, Paul, for 6 plus years, and saw a lot of things happen. Had a lot of great experiences. Was a proud member of the service during my time, and in 2001, I left and went on to do some other work.
And what did that other work? I think it's good for the audience to understand here because I have a question from
Okay.
people saying the RCMP is not geared up to do modern crime, cyber crime, etc., and are no good in federal policing. You have some background in those areas. Can you just
I,
elucidate?
I do, Paul, and thanks for prodding me a little bit on that. So at 36 plus years in with the RCMP, and out of the blue, I received a call from somebody I didn't know who was with the government of Ontario, and they were looking for someone to head up and reshape, update the government of Ontario IT policy and to play an important role in the updating of the Ontario government IT network. So I was there for 3.5 years, worked diligently on developing the policy and updating the IT security policy. The submission was made to management board. It was approved. I stayed there for a period of time throughout implementation. And following that, I became the Vice President and Chief Security Officer for one of Canada's 5 big, what I call international banks. And I think you're probably alluding there, Paul, to cyber experience. And one of the great things about the private sector is there's a bottom line. And the bottom line dictates more or less the actions that we take to lead to success or failure. And government cultures, as you know, and the RCMP has a particular culture, which really didn't lend itself during the time I was there, in my view, to having the freedom to do what one needed to do to take on an issue such as cyber. So when I arrived at the bank that I worked at, they had less than a handful of attacks. And what I did is I hired kids, call them kids, who had successfully completed 4-year IT management courses at institutions that at that time were called Ryerson or Waterloo, and brought them in. And under my leadership, we had a great time developing the strategies. The kids, and I hate to call them kids, but they knew what was happening. And they had the savvy to help the bank develop the strategies to protect the bank. And I don't think you could do that in any police organization, to tell you the truth. And I think it kind of draws on the culture where in a police organization, the regular member, the uniform folks, that's the dominant culture in these organizations. And civilians are a subculture of that. And it's very difficult, I think, to be as progressive as you can be in other sectors. And we had a lot of success.
So, Curt, just to follow up on that question, at that time, were the banks way ahead of the RCMP in terms of being able, just having a capacity to deal with cybercrime type issues?
Well, I think what I would say, Adam, is that the banks aren't alone in the private sector and in terms of embracing technology. I don't think police services have been leaders in technology and IT, to tell you the truth. I had a great time at the bank that I worked at, but we had much better technology. But not only that, we had the appetite to learn. We had the bottom line, don't forget. We had one particular bank in Canada at that time that fell prey to successful DNS attacks. And over again, we took security very seriously. We learned a lot about planning. We learned a lot about tabletop exercises. We learned a lot about real exercises, the kinds of things that one has to do to stay ahead of the game. And I don't think that other sectors, and I think policing is one, I think in some provinces it's better than it is in others, but that I think falls back to the form of governance that exists in the various provinces.
Curt, I'd love to have you in the future. I think we're going to be talking more and more about this, but for the purposes of this show, we began this show with the mass casualty in Nova Scotia in 2020. Tell Adam and our audience how you got involved in this in the background.
Well, I don't think there was a Canadian that didn't take note of this unfortunate event. The pain and sorrow for the families, the victims, the RCMP itself, because it lost a member, was sharply criticized for the way it went down. I, as a former member of the RCMP, I took notice of it when it happened on the 18th. I had been in Florida prior in the winter, came home, and I'll always remember learning about the event on the news. We're an hour behind Atlantic Canada, and so we were monitoring it the best we could. There was a lot of things that went through my mind, Paul. I'm based on my experience. I mean, I wasn't there, I was 1,000 miles away. But in Ontario, we have emergency alerts. So one of the things I thought about was what kind of alerting system was used so that people knew what was going on. That I think is very important. And I learned later that there was no emergency alert. Some of the other things I thought about was how sophisticated was the plan? Who was in charge? I was really curious about who on the ground was in charge, the experience of that individual. I was curious about how call out worked, how organized and sophisticated was the system of gathering people together and having them respond. It's hard work to make sure that you have that in your mind, the need to have an organized and an up-to-date call out plan, and a plan itself in terms of how you're going to approach an issue of that nature. So the emergency alert was probably the first thing I thought of. The plan, who was in command on the ground, how senior was that individual, and what was the experience. It was 2020 when that happened, and I was involved in a similar, although very different event in New Brunswick in the 70s. In the 70s, New Brunswick had a helicopter. And I started thinking about eyes in the sky. So you're calling members out in an area where many of them would not be familiar with the territory. And today, and in 2020, I would immediately wonder what eyes there were in the sky. Drones, an airplane. It's very difficult to expect members to go into an unfamiliar area without there being some guidance over top. And if I had been a member called out to attend without the eyes in the sky, I would have been concerned, very concerned today and 2020, certainly. And and as time progressed, I learned that there were no drones, I don't think. The other thing was like what technical equipment was used. And certainly K9 unit isn't technical, the training is very technical. But was there a K9 unit? In my my previous experience in New Brunswick had a helicopter, but it wasn't available, which is often the case. And New Brunswick had a K9 unit, which wasn't available either. I was in Campbellton, which is a long ways away from Fredericton. Unfortunately, many of these resources are usually kept in a location that's not very close to where you might need them.
Curt, one of the things that I remember in our earliest discussions, was you focused on the white shirts, the upper management. You couldn't believe, as correct me if I'm wrong, that they didn't seem to be involved or were invisible.
Well, what I said just a few moments ago was I was very interested in knowing how senior the commander of that incident was. In other words, who on the ground was accountable for the response. And I have not heard to this day that there were several senior officers who were actually called out and took control of the issue. And I think that was evident. There was a press conference, as I recall, on the Monday morning. And I was disappointed with the press conference because it didn't seem to me that the people who participated really had a handle on what had happened over the weekend. And that was surprising.
At what level would you have expected command to have been? Where held, at a local, not a corporal, a sergeant, or a white shirt. Like, where would you have expected that to settle?
White shirt. I would have expected white shirt. I would have expected more than white shirt to be involved. And I think an incident of that nature had I still been in the service, which I was not, I would have expected the crops officer to know exactly what was going on from a moment to moment basis. And I would have expected the crops officer to have a superintendent on the ground.
Well, the
The
crops officer, for those who aren't familiar, is the criminal operations officer. In that case was Chief Superintendent Chris Leather. Also, there was Superintendent Archie Thompson, who sort of disappeared into the woodwork. His testimony was that, oh yeah, he was alerted and he just stood by the wall and didn't want to interfere in the operation on the Sunday morning. Does that strike you as normal?
No, I mean, I don't know exactly what happened, right? I would have expected there to be senior leadership on the ground taking charge, and that's their role from my perspective.
what about the thought, Curt, that a lot of people are say, well, it's an unusual situation. That kind of goes without saying. That's so the shocking and unusual nature of it. All right, cut some people slack. They wouldn't have expected this. Nobody was ready for this. It would take some time to develop a plan and put everything into place and, give everyone a break.
Well, I think, I understand what people say when they say that. I'm I'm all about public safety, and I'm all about planning, organizing, and understanding. We have to be prepared for these issues. I served 6 years. I just stepped down from my term, expired on a regional police service here in Ontario, one of the big so-called Big 12. And the governance in Ontario is very different. And I want to talk about boards and the governance here, but probably not right now. I think we have to be prepared, and it goes to call out, it goes to our planning, it goes to understanding that these things can happen. And they're unusual when they happen, but that's why we have at our disposal equipment. We have the eyes in the sky. We have the canine unit. We have the senior leadership that takes charge. We have a plan. We have an organized call out. We make sure that we take care of our own people. I learned that we lost a member, very sad situation. I was surprised that at that stage of the operation, there were one member in a car, as an example. That struck me as being unusual.
Well, 19 people were already dead at that point. They didn't know that, but they knew a lot of people were dead. And Heidi Stevenson went into the situation alone, unprepared, under-equipped, under-trained, under-supervised, without any communication about the seriousness of the situation. Could you envision that happening in Ontario at any time in the police forces you dealt with?
Well, I think Ontario is a different situation. And we have Ontario for 30 years has had boards who are the employer of the police services, local boards. I served on one in my region here for 6 years. In Ontario, the board is the employer. The board is constituted, in my case here, they can be either 5, 7, or 9 members. In my case, they were not 7. We had 7 members. 4 of them are appointed by the regional government, and 3, one like myself, is a public appointee. We are the employer. We hire the chief, we hire the executive directly. We delegate the responsibility to the chief to hire the other staff, as an example. But we have plans, we have governance plans. We have expectations. We don't direct the police chief operationally, but we create policy that sets the framework and the expectations within which the operations are to happen. And that's a totally different situation, I think, than happens in the so-called contract provinces of Canada, where the RCMP is a service.
Well, the RCMP essentially takes no orders from anyone, do they?
Well, I'm not sure that I didn't feel that way when I was in the organization for 36 years. there certainly is a boss. But, in Ontario, the governance model today, it's the board that's responsible and writes the plan, the strategic plan for the service. It's not service, it's the board. And the board therefore sets the expectations and the objectives, and that's the local board. And that board is accountable. The government creates the legislation, creates the regulations, but the board is the employer, and the board is accountable.
Curt, does that make a big difference in terms of I guess, the public's attitudes towards policing if they see that there is that local, ownership in a sense, certainly oversight, compared to a contract policing situation where sometimes it seems like at least the oversight is in Ottawa if it exists, right? And there isn't that local connection in a sense.
Yeah, I think you've hit on something that's important. I mean, when I was all the years that I was in the force, and as much as there was discussion about provinces having consultation and that kind of thing, there's a vast difference when the board is the employer, when a local board is the employer of the police organization. And in my case, it wasn't a large organization, it was 1,200 people, 800 or so uniforms, and the rest were civilians. But the accountability is around the table at meetings, and the policies that are created, the governance structure that's created. And that governance structure is on our website, 14 or 15 governance policies. It says what the chief has to do, the reporting that has to occur to the board. And the community sees that. In the development of the last strategic plan, there was a community survey that was done. We hired a third party to do a professional community survey on public satisfaction. And that gets input into the strategic plan. And there's a world of difference, I think. And I will say to you that 25 years ago, I first started thinking that it was time for change, and I haven't changed my mind. I'm very excited by what some of the provinces are doing as they examine their policing models. I think there will be more change. It hurts me to say at one level that the RCMP will be smaller before it gets bigger, but that's what's going to happen. And that's what has to happen. I think that's where we are today. And some of the provinces are examining that. I know Halifax is examining it as well to a certain extent. And I think that's the future of policing.
Well, what you're suggesting is that it seems to me that the RCMP should be a strictly federal police force, getting out of contract policing. Correct me if I'm wrong. And should they be even named the Royal Canadian Mounted Police? There's a couple of questions for you.
I think you and I've talked about a number of these things before, Paul. No, I don't think. I think that the name the Royal Canadian Mounted Police has had its day. Here's what I felt my last several years in the RCMP. The mandate was too broad. If you look at, like, I don't know of any other country that has and expects one organization to do provincial policing in 8 of 10 provinces and territories, to have a first-class federal presence, to at the same time operate in major municipalities across the country, and while at the same time trying to lead the national police services. And the national police services are critical to this country and to the credibility and integrity of policing. When you look at things like the forensic laboratories, that program, and some of the other things that are housed in national police services. I just felt a long time ago, many, many years ago, that mandate was very broad. And, like, to this day, I mean, police officers in every service go through boot camp. I think we need to professionalize, and we are in many provinces. Some are far ahead of others in terms of the civilian expertise that's brought into the organizations. Um, the I think that's an important change. But I felt for probably 25 years that the mandate of the RCMP was too broad for one to be in one organization. And I think when you're trying to do all things for everybody, it's easy to have that sort of shade away somewhat. And I think today I hope that the National Police Services have the integrity that they need for this country. I do believe, however, that 2/3 of the people of this country have never been policed provincially by the RCMP, and I think in those jurisdictions there's probably been less criticism over the last 20 or 30 years in terms of the nature of the service that's been provided. And I think we should take a lesson from some of that the RCMP doesn't have to be involved in all, and can it be, and should it be? Is that manageable? If we look at the United States as an example, much larger country, but that's certainly not the case.
What about the name?
You're not going to let go of that, I guess. I could tell you a funny story. Well, maybe it wasn't funny, but as a senior officer, I had to introduce the musical ride a number of times, and I can remember always sort of amusingly looking at the maple leaf that was stamped on the horse's rear and wondering what Canadians would think if suddenly it became a computer. I think that day has gone, to tell you the truth. I mean, the name Royal Canadian Mounted Police, I don't think it would cause people to think of modern day policing, the kind of technology that's necessary for modern day policing, the kind of training and expertise that we need, the mix of resources that we need, the technology, the equipment. I think that day has come and gone, Paul. And
Yeah, that's yeah, the whole thing, the Royal Royal, is it is that still a thing? Canadian, it's not really across the country, although the federal aspect, I guess, is Canadian, and the horses are a little less relevant than they may have once been.
well, when I went, when I went in boot camp, it's kind of struck me, skinny little kid from Nova Scotia, and I learned that the curriculum comprised of 240 hours horseback riding and 100 hours of criminal law study. And I must say, I wished often that was reversed the other way, because I wasn't the greatest horseback rider.
Coming from Yarmouth, you might not have had a ton of experience with horseback riding before you went off to Regina.
Well, you're saying that banging your butt on the back of a horse is not a good qualification for being a police officer?
Well, I could tell you some stories about how we dealt with that, but might be better at another time. But 240 hours riding horseback. I was there during the winter, and I can tell you that what we used to call the back 40 was known behind the stables at Regina when it was minus 25 or 30 in the blizzard, and you were wearing a buffalo coat and you had newspaper folded around your legs and side of your breeches so your knees didn't get too cold. And actually, the saddle sores wore on over time, and as a group of 32 men we found that going downtown Regina and buying some silk ladies underwear helped that significantly.
That didn't make the Regina newspaper, did it? The
No, but it's on this podcast.
that's great. Yeah,
Okay, well,
yeah.
I got one last question
Good
for
story.
you.
Okay.
We were earlier in the show before you came on, we were talking about J. Michael MacDonald getting the Order of Canada for his work, partly for his work on the Mass Casualty Commission. What did the Mass Casualty Commission tell you? What did you get out of it?
Well, I don't know, Paul. Like I live 1,000 miles away, and sometimes that feels good. I I served in the RCMP during the time of the commission that delved into the security service so-called burning of the barn in Quebec. That I'm sure, well, those of us at my age certainly remember. And I remember the consequences of that commission on the RCMP. And I remember that security service was no more. And I served in security service, and I was in CSIS at the time it was created. And then I came back to the RCMP. Um, you know, one of the things that I struggle with is there has been study upon study upon study done of the RCMP. And this commission, in some ways, is no different. The recommendations are very familiar. They're very similar. And you can go back over many, many years, a decade or more, 15 years ago. And the studies that have been done usually come up with the same, if not very similar recommendations. And I think that says a lot in terms of where we are today.
And nothing gets changed.
Well, it would seem to me that if there was change, the recommendation should not be the same study after study.
Yeah,
That's right.
that's a great point. That's a great point. Kurt, we usually keep the shows to about an hour or so, and we're hitting up on that. But it kind of feels like we're just kind of getting warmed up with you here. I think it'd be great to speak for Paul, and I'm sure the audience. We'd love to have you back to continue the conversation, get into some more policing views, your thoughts on the RCMP structure, all those kinds of things. As I'm sure there's a lot more to mine in there.
Yeah, no, I would just say one thing. And Paul and I have talked about this. I think the structure is dated. I think and I'm not trying to defend what happened in Nova Scotia or anywhere else at any time when there was a serious event. But with 53 detachments scattered along the coast, and you can try be damned to have the best plan, it's hard to gather a critical mass of people on a moment's notice. And I know there have been studies done on other provinces. We have regions in Ontario, and in the GTA, the police services are by and large regional in nature, and that affords a critical mass of people. It's much easier to train. It's much easier to have training for your people, to have the best training, to have active shooter ranges and that kind of thing that members can visit and train at. And I just think that in today's world, having 53 detachments dotting a coastline or whatever number there is in any other province isn't the way forward. I'll leave it at that. But I would love, there's so much to talk about. There's never been a more interesting time, I don't think, in policing, particularly in this Canada with this large land mass and the need for public safety and the changes in society and that kind of thing. I'd love to have a dialogue with you guys going forward.
When you actually said something there about the 53 detachments. Earlier, you said I was with a small regional police force, which was 1,200 members between citizens, sworn members and citizens, right?
Right.
Well, that's still bigger than the RCMP component in Nova Scotia. But in Nova Scotia, they treat it like it's a big thing. And you say they divided this relatively small police force, about the size of Hamilton, Ontario's police force, into 53 detachments. That seems to be the problem going forward.
Well, I think today I think that's a model of the past. Let's put it that way. That's what I would say. It's a model of the past. And I think that other areas are moving away from that kind of a model, although the OPP still have a large number of detachments. One thing I didn't say under governance is that every OPP detachment is going to have a board. That's in the works right now. And I haven't seen all of the regulations on that, but governance is very different in the province of Ontario, and I'm very happy to see that and to say that.
Well, it seems like that's a big step for Nova Scotia to take too. Well, we'll see what happens with Nova Scotia overall. There's a lot of unknowns at this point, but Curt, we'll continue this discussion with you at on a future show, and I'm sure the audience is going to enjoy that a lot. And we want to thank you so much for coming in and joining us today. And yeah, very much appreciated.
Thank you, guys. A
Thank
pleasure.
you, Kurt. Thanks a
Yeah.
million.
All right, we'll see everybody next week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching.
Bye
Thanks
bye.
for listening.